Hello, RotoBallers. Consider me your magic man here in week number 13. I can make anything you want appear. Superheroes, cute animals, wizards, must-start running backs, and tight ends. Yes, that's right. I got it all. Boom. Here we go. Start Tony Pollard versus the Seattle Seahawks. Pollard is starting to look like the back we saw in 2022 here. Looking at his efficiency the last couple weeks, he has gotten that yards per carry back over 5 yards while forcing 15 missed tackles over the previous 3 contests. Last week, Pollard accounted for a 78% snap share while adding a 67% route participation. Meanwhile, the Seahawks, they allowed over 110 yards on the ground and a pair of touchdowns to Christian McCaffrey, not to mention 5 receptions for additional 25 yards back in week number 12. Seattle's run defense, it has improved from last season, but in the last 4 weeks, they are allowing more than 33 fantasy points per game to the running back position. And in that 4-week period, that has added up to over 700 total yards and 7 touchdowns. Start Ramondre Stevenson, as my buddy used to call him, Ramondre Stevenson, pew, 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 against the Los Angeles Chargers. This is a juicy matchup. Stevenson is coming off a top 10 fantasy performance against the New York Giants just a week ago and now has produced 100 total yards in each of his last 3 contests. This Patriots offense, it is a mess, but the one thing that you can trust is Stevenson's involvement as he ran for 98 yards on 21 carries and caught all 5 of his targets. On the season, the Chargers are allowing the 9th most fantasy points to backs, and over the last 4 weeks, the 26 plus fantasy points that they have been allowing is the 5th most. Opportunities matter, and against the Giants, Stevenson had 26 carries and targets compared to Elliott's 11. Outside of week number 15 against the Chiefs, Stevenson has a great fantasy schedule when it matters the most. My third running back to start this week is Raheem Mostert versus the Washington Commanders. The Commanders are allowing the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing backs over the last 4 weeks, and last week it was no different. Tony Pollard produced 79 yards on the ground on just 13 attempts. Miami, they are going to put this Commanders secondary through that stress test, and when it's all said and done, probably before halftime, expect them to finish them off with the run game. And Rachaad White, let's put some respect on the man's name. He goes against Carolina. With as often as Rachaad White has been on my must-start list, you would think he'd be an automatic plug-and-play. Well, this week he's coming off a 100-yard performance, and he faces the Carolina Panthers. Don't overthink it. Start him. Who do you sit? You're going to sit Brian Robinson against that Miami Dolphins defense. This feels like a bad game script developing right now. We saw Antonio Gibson return last week and take away some of those valuable touches away from Robinson, and Miami, they have been one of the best defenses since Jalen Ramsey returned back in week number 8, going from 26 points per game allowed to just 16. Now Miami, they're going to force the Commanders to basically abandon the run game and become one-dimensional if they want to stay in this game. Need proof? Over the last 4 weeks, the Dolphins have yielded less than 200 yards on the ground and no touchdowns. Another running back you have to sit this week is Javonte Williams versus the Houston Texans. Williams, he sat back and he watched both Russell Wilson and Samaje Perine hit pay dirt last week while being limited to just 65 yards on 16 carries. Williams has seen at least a 60% rush share in 4 straight games prior to week 12, but that number, it dipped below 47%. The Browns, they stacked the box against the Broncos last week, and that is something that I'm expecting DeMeco Ryans to continue to do here this week. Houston have allowed the 5th fewest points to backs over the last 4 weeks after struggling early on in the season. Finally, sit Kyren Williams. Yes, I am sitting Kyren Williams against the Cleveland Browns. For this to work, the Browns defense, it has to be healthy, Denzel Ward included. After all, Kyren Williams, he returned from the IR and promptly became the RB1 last week, rushing for 143 yards, catching 6 passes for 61 yards, adding a couple scores, but that was against the Arizona Cardinals, a team that is allowing the 2nd most fantasy points to the position this season. Well, Cleveland has allowed the 8th fewest over the last 4 weeks and just under 19 fantasy points per game. Now let's move along to those tight ends, starting with Evan Ingram of the Jacksonville Jaguars as they take on the Cincinnati Bengals, who are allowing the 10th most fantasy points to tight ends, and over the last 4 weeks, that is the 3rd most points to tight ends. So we're looking at roughly 15 fantasy points per contest in which they've yielded over the last 4 weeks. Ingram's performance against the Texans was somewhat disappointing, being held under 10 fantasy points, but he did have 8 targets, so that is something that we can definitely look forward to. Ingram has seen at least 7 targets or more in 9 of 11 games this season, so the opportunities, they are going to be there. You can also bank on Ingram hauling in at least 5 passes, which is something that he has done on 7 occasions this season. While the Bengals, they are allowing 6 receptions per game to tight tight ends, something has to give. Ingram has 0 touchdowns on 82 targets. Bold prediction, that changes this week. The second tight end that I'm starting is another guy who disappointed last week, and it's Dalton Schultz versus the Denver Broncos. Hey, I can admit when I was wrong. 1 catch for 2 yards would definitely say, hey, you were wrong last week. But here I am, back in the saddle again against the Broncos defense that has been as good as any defense as of late. But they have been susceptible to the tight end position, allowing nearly 19 fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks, which happens to be the 4th most. And finally, the third tight end I'm starting this week. If you need a streamer, stream Chig Okonkwo against the Indianapolis Colts. He's the play here. Indianapolis, they've allowed the 7th most fantasy points this season to the tight end position, and they're allowing more than 16 fantasy points over the last 4 weeks, which happens to be the 5th most. Okonkwo, he's coming off an adequate fantasy performance against the Panthers, in which he caught 4 or 5 targets for 45 yards. Now those tight ends that I'm sitting, we start with Los Angeles Rams tight end Tyler Higbee versus the Cleveland Browns. This is what Higbee does. You get all high on him to start the season. He does absolutely nothing. You put him in your lineup, he does absolutely nothing. And then when you forget about him, he goes out there and catches 2 touchdown receptions. I am not falling for this trick, people. This is a trap if I've ever seen one here. Look, he had 29 yards on those 5 targets. 29 yards. That is not tight end 1 type numbers. That is something you're not going to get excited about. He isn't catching 2 touchdowns every single week, and he certainly isn't catching 2 touchdowns against a Browns team that's only allowed 3 scores all season long, while allowing less than 6 fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks. Another tight end that I'm not excited about is Gerald Everett of the Chargers going against the New England Patriots. Everett is a matchup-based starter, and this week is not that matchup. I'm actually surprised that he didn't hurt himself doing that Ray Lewis celebration there last week. This week he faced the Patriots defense that has allowed the 5th lowest fantasy production to tight ends this season, have allowed just 399 yards and 1 touchdown. And finally, don't go chasing waterfalls and don't go chasing those fantasy points when it comes to Pat Freiermuth. Hear me out. Arizona has allowed the 9th fewest fantasy points to tight ends this season. However, they've allowed the 15th most to wide receivers and the 3rd most in the last 4 weeks to the running back position. Look, this Steelers offense could use a little extra help here from the wide receivers and running backs to get this offense going here in week number 13 as they get things ready for that playoff push. Once again, I remind you that this video is being recorded on Monday, so plenty can happen between now and Sunday's kickoffs. So make sure you are checking out RotoBaller.com and the RotoBaller Discord channel for all the latest fantasy football news. Make sure to hit that like button. Make sure you're subscribed for all the latest fantasy football analysis right here on the RotoBaller YouTube channel.